Ethan Walker hadn't spoken a woman's name in 7 years, not since the world decided he was a man worth forgetting. But when he found her collapsed in the summer dust at the edge of his property, her dress torn, her hands clutching a leather envelope like it was the last thing keeping her alive. Something cracked open inside his chest that he'd spent a decade trying to seal shut. She looked up at him with those desperate blue eyes and said the 3 words that changed everything. "You're Ethan Walker." And God help him, he didn't deny it. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to the channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 didn't arrive gentle in the Colorado mountains. It came the way trouble always came to Ethan Walker, without warning, without mercy, and right when he'd finally started believing the quiet might last. He'd been up before sunrise, same as every morning, working the fence line on the eastern edge of his property where the elk had broken through twice that week. The heat was already sitting heavy on the back of his neck by the time the sun cleared the ridgeline, and the air smelled of dry pine and something else, something faint and wrong that he couldn't name yet. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself that a lot. Ethan had built his whole life up here on that telling, that the smoke he smelled wasn't fire, that the sound he heard wasn't a rider, that the ache in his chest every morning was just the altitude, and not the thing he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was gone. He kept working the fence. He was good at that. The post had just settled into the ground when he heard it. Not a scream exactly, more like the ghost of one, the kind of sound that a person makes when they've already used up all their screaming, and what's left is just breath and desperation. It came from down the slope, toward the old logging trail that cut through the southern edge of his land. Ethan straightened. He stood there a full 10 seconds, hands wrapped around the fence post, telling himself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. A hawk. Then he heard his name. Not shouted. Not called out with any strength behind it. Just breathed into the summer air like a prayer from someone who'd run out of other prayers to try. Ethan Walker. He was already moving before he made the decision to move. The trail was rough going on foot, and he half slid down the slope, grabbing pine branches to slow himself, his boots raising dust with every step. He cleared the tree line and stopped cold. She was on her knees in the middle of the trail. Her dress, the color it had been, once might have been blue, a soft summer blue, the kind a woman wears when she's traveling somewhere she hopes will be better than where she left, was torn along the left shoulder and streaked with dirt and dried blood. Her hair, light brown shot through with gold, had come mostly loose from whatever arrangement it had started the day in, and it hung across her face in the heat. She was holding a leather envelope against her chest with both hands gripping it, the way you grip something when you're afraid someone's going to come take it from you. She looked up when she heard his boots on the trail, and for one terrible moment he thought she was going to run from him. Her body tensed. Her breath stuttered, but then she looked at his face, and something in her seemed to make a decision. "You're Ethan Walker," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who's asking?" he said, and even as the words came out he was scanning the trail behind her, reading the signs he'd spent years learning to read, the drag marks in the dust. The way her left foot was angled wrong. The blood on the back of her right hand that was too fresh to be from today's fall. "My name is Abigail Carter." She got one foot under her, tried to stand, and didn't make it. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and caught her before she hit the ground, and she grabbed his forearm with a grip that surprised him, strong, deliberate, nothing fragile about it despite everything. "I've been looking for you for 4 months. 4 months, he repeated. "Don't let go of this." She pressed the leather envelope into his hands. "Whatever happens, don't let anyone take this from you." "Ma'am, what happened to you? Where did you come from?" "There was a wagon." She said it like she was reporting facts, like she was trying very hard to stay in the practical and out of everything else. "2 men. They knew I was coming here. They knew I had those documents." She nodded toward the envelope in his hands. "They ran the wagon off the trail about 2 miles south. The horse—" She stopped, swallowed. "I walked. 2 miles, in this heat, with whatever damage had been done to her left ankle. You walked 2 miles, he said. I had to get to you. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the envelope. Then he looked back up the trail, because that was the kind of man he was always checking the perimeter, always counting the exits. 10 years of solitude hadn't cured him of that, even when he'd wanted it to. Can you walk if I help you? He asked. I can do whatever needs doing, she said, and the steadiness in her voice when everything else about her situation said she had every right to fall apart. That was the thing that got under his skin. Not in the way he would have admitted to anyone, but it got there. My ranch is about a 1/4 mile up the slope, he said. I'm going to put my arm around you, and we're going to take it slow. You tell me if I need to stop. Mr. Walker. Ethan. Ethan. She looked at him with those blue eyes that were working very hard to be steady and mostly succeeding. They'll come back. The men who did this. They will come looking for those documents. I expect they will, he said. I need you to understand what I'm bringing to your door. Ma'am, he said, you can explain it all to me once you're sitting down, and I've had a look at that ankle. Right now, I need you to let me help you up this hill. She studied him like she was trying to determine something, whether he was trustworthy maybe, or whether the man she'd spent 4 months tracking down was actually the man she'd hoped to find. Whatever she saw, it seemed to satisfy something in her. She let him take her weight. They made it up the slope slowly, Ethan matching his pace to hers, his hand steady at her waist and his eyes moving constantly along the tree line. She didn't complain once. She didn't make a sound that suggested weakness. She just breathed through whatever it cost her and kept moving forward. His ranch wasn't much to look at. He'd built it himself and built it for function, not for any notion of what a home ought to look like. The cabin was solid, the kind of solid that came from cutting the logs yourself and fitting the joins yourself and caring about the work even when you'd stopped caring much about most other things. There was a small barn, a vegetable patch that had gotten out of hand this summer because he'd let it well, and a porch with 2 chairs he'd made himself and never had reason to use more than one of. He got her to the porch and eased her down into the second chair, the one that hadn't been used in the 7 years he'd been up here, and something about that struck him in a way he didn't examine too closely. I'm going to get water in my kit, he said. Don't move that ankle. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He came back with a bucket of well water, a clean cloth, his medicine kit, and the better part of his composure reestablished. He crouched down in front of her and carefully started unlacing her boot. You're going to tell me this doesn't need looking at, he said. I was going to tell you exactly that. And you'd be wrong. The ankle was swollen badly, an ugly purple-red bloom spreading from the outside edge. He probed it gently with his fingers, watching her face rather than the ankle to gauge the damage. She hissed through her teeth once at the outside bone, but otherwise held herself still. It's not broken, he said. Sprained bad. You'll need to stay off it. I can't afford to stay off it. You can't afford not to. He started wrapping it with strips of clean cloth from the kit. You said 2 men. Did you get a look at either of them? One of them I recognized. She said it carefully, like she was deciding while she spoke how much to say. He worked for a man named Jonathan Blackwell. He's a land investor out of Denver. Very wealthy, very well connected. She paused. He's the man who destroyed your life, Ethan. His hands stilled on the wrapping. The name hit him somewhere low and old, in the part of him that he'd built all this silence around. He'd spent 7 years not hearing that name said out loud. He'd spent 7 years building fences and cutting wood and growing food he didn't particularly enjoy eating, just to fill the hours, just to keep his hands busy, so they didn't reach for the thing they'd been trained to reach for. Where did you hear that name? He said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that. From the documents in that envelope. She nodded toward where he'd said it on the porch railing. And from my own family's records, which is a longer conversation, and one I owe you. She hesitated, and for the first time since he'd found her on the trail, she looked like she might be something other than in complete control of herself. I owe you an apology, Ethan, before anything else. I owe you that. He finished the wrapping and sat back on his heels. "Let's start simpler," he said. "Let's start with what's in that envelope." She reached for it herself, unwound the leather cord from the button, and pulled out a sheaf of papers that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases were soft as cloth. She spread them carefully across her knee. "Correspondence," she said, "between Jonathan Blackwell and a man named Harlan Good, who at the time was the territorial magistrate in Summit County. Letters going back to 1870. And sworn affidavits from 3 witnesses who were present the night of the Clearwater incident." Ethan went very still. He hadn't heard the word Clearwater in 7 years either. "Where did you get these?" he said. Not a question. Something harder than a question. "My uncle worked for Blackwell's land company from 1869 to 1872, she said. "He kept copies of everything. He told me it was insurance that if he ever needed to run from Blackwell, he'd have something to run with." She folded her hands over the papers in her lap. "He died in March. He left these to me with a letter explaining what they were." She met his eyes. "And what they proved." "What do they prove?" he said, even though something in him already knew the way you know sometimes, before you know a gathering sense of something enormous approaching the pressure change before the storm. "They prove that the Clearwater massacre was ordered by Blackwell," she said. "That Harlan Good falsified the military report. That the scout who was blamed for the order, the scout who was court-martialed and driven out of the territory in disgrace, never gave any such order." She didn't look away from him. "That you tried to stop it, Ethan. That you rode out ahead of the column to warn the encampment, and Blackwell's men pulled you back by force. That you were fighting 2 of his men when the shooting started, which is why you were found at the edge of the site and not in the middle of it with everyone else." Her voice was steady and quiet and absolutely certain. "They framed you because you were the only witness who might have talked." The summer sound of the mountains came in around them. Birdsong wind in the pines, the distant movement of the creek down the slope, and Ethan sat in the middle of all that peace he'd built for himself and felt it receding from him like water. "Why are you bringing this to me?" he said. "Because it belongs to you." "I don't want it." "Ethan, I don't want it," he said again, and he stood up and walked to the edge of the porch and put his hands on the railing and looked out at the mountains he'd been looking at for 7 years. "You want to know what I did with Clearwater? I buried it. Every morning I come out here and I look at those mountains and I think about the people who are gone, and I carry it. That's what I do with it. And it took me a long time to figure out how to carry it without it killing me." "I know," she said quietly. "I know it cost you. I can see it." "Then you understand why I'm not interested in digging it back up. I understand why you'd want to say that." She wasn't arguing with him exactly. She was just staying with him in the conversation, not letting him walk away from it, even while his hands gripped that railing. But Ethan Blackwell isn't done. He's not a man who ever stops. Right now he's buying up land in 3 counties, running off families who've been on their claims for a decade, bribing every official between here and Denver. He has the Hendersons' ranch under a fraudulent lien. He ran the Callaways off their land last spring, and when Jerome Callaway went to contest it, he... She stopped. "He what?" Ethan said without turning around. "Jerome Callaway had an accident," she said carefully. "Fell from his horse on a road he'd ridden every day for 20 years. Ethan's grip on the railing tightened. "How many families?" he said. "7 that I know of. Probably more." The wind moved through the pines. Down at the barn, his horse shifted and stamped. "You said you followed me for 4 months, he said. "Yes." "You tracked me here." "You weren't easy to find," she said. And there was something in her voice that might have been the start of a wry smile under different circumstances. "You've been very committed to not being found. I had good reason for that." He turned around. She was watching him with those serious blue eyes, the papers still spread across her knee, her ankle wrapped in his cloth, sitting in the chair that no one had sat in for 7 years. "Miss Carter, Abigail. Those men who ran your wagon off the trail, they knew you were coming here specifically. They knew about the documents, and they knew where you were headed." "Yes, which means they know you made it here, or they'll be looking for your body and not finding it." "Yes." So they'll come here. Yes, she said again. I know what I've brought to your door. I told you that on the trail. I need you to understand I'm not asking you to fix this alone. I just needed these documents to get to someone who has a reason to fight back with them and the knowledge to know how to use them. I'm not a fighter anymore, Ethan said. I know that's what you believe. It's not a belief, ma'am. It's a decision I made. I respect that decision, she said. I do. But can I ask you something? She waited until he gave her a short nod. 7 years ago, when they took your name from you, when they stripped your rank filed, the false court record ran you out of the territory. Did you decide then that you were going to live like you deserved it? Like maybe they were right about you? He didn't answer. Because I don't think you believe you deserved it, she said. I think you came up here because you were in pain and the world was cruel to you, and this was the only place that felt safe. And I understand that. I'm not judging that. But Ethan, she spread the papers on her knee with one careful hand. These prove you didn't deserve any of it, and the families in this valley, the Hendersons, the Callaways, the Brewers, the other people whose names I have in these documents, they don't deserve what's happening to them either. The silence between them was the kind that had weight to it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the papers. Then he looked out at the mountains again, at the long summer light going gold across the ridgeline. You said your family was connected to what happened, he said finally. Your uncle worked for Blackwell. Yes. Your uncle kept these documents for 8 years and didn't come forward with them. The pause was brief, but he caught it. Yes. Why? Because he was afraid, she said. Because Blackwell is the kind of man who makes people afraid. And because... She stopped, breathed. Because my uncle made choices I don't agree with, and he lived with those choices, and at the end of his life, he gave me these papers because he wanted something good to come from it. He wanted someone to be brave when he hadn't been. She looked up at him. I'm trying to be that. I know I'm probably not doing it perfectly. I know I arrived at your door broken and scared, and I've dropped a catastrophe in your lap, and you have every right to send me away. I'm not sending you anywhere, he said immediately. Not today. Not with that ankle, and not with 2 men somewhere in these mountains who know you're here. Something shifted in her face, not quite relief. More like the cautious acknowledgement that one thing at least was settled. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. He came back to the porch and picked up the leather envelope and tucked it under his arm. I'm going to read these. Of course. And then I'm going to think. Take all the time you need. And while I think, he said, I need you to tell me everything you know about Blackwell's operation. Where his men are stationed, who his contacts are in the local law, everything. Can you do that? She straightened, and even with the torn dress and the wrapped ankle and the day she'd had, she looked ready, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask her exactly that. Yes, she said. I can do that. He pulled the second porch chair around so it faced hers and sat down, and for the first time in 7 years, Ethan Walker wasn't sitting alone on that porch. Then start from the beginning, he said. She started talking, and the summer light faded slowly across the mountains, and Ethan listened, and somewhere down in the valley, in a direction he couldn't see. Yet something was coming that would ask him to decide once and for all what kind of man he was going to be. He didn't know that yet, but he was beginning to suspect it. Outside, the shadows of the pines had stretched long across the yard when Abigail finally stopped talking. Her voice had held steady through all of it, through the names of the families, through the details of the land fraud, through the account of Jerome Calloway's convenient accident on a road he knew better than his own hands. She'd been precise and organized in the way of someone who'd been sitting with this information for months, turning it over, cataloging it, preparing to present it. Only at the end, when she described the morning she'd opened her uncle's letter and read for the first time what had been done to Ethan Walker, did her voice change slightly, a slight roughening, quickly controlled. He wrote that he was sorry, she said. My uncle. That wasn't enough, and he knew it, but he wrote it anyway. Ethan had been sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking at the ground between his boots, listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your uncle's name," he said. "Robert Carter." Ethan thought for a moment. Then, "He was the surveyor, Blackwell's land surveyor." "Yes, I remember him." He said it without accusation, which seemed to cost him something. He was at the inquiry. He testified that the column's position was consistent with an unauthorized advance order. He said, Ethan stopped. "He said he saw my signature on the advance authorization." Abigail's hands were very still in her lap. "I know what he said." "Was it true?" "No." No hesitation, no softening. The authorization was forged. One of the letters in that envelope is from Blackwell to Harlan Good, discussing specifically which document to forge and how to get Robert Carter's cooperation. She met his eyes. "My uncle signed an affidavit in the last weeks of his life, correcting his testimony. It's in the envelope. I know that doesn't undo what he did. I know a deathbed correction 8 years later doesn't give you back what was taken from you." "No," Ethan said. "It doesn't." "I know." Another silence. The first stars were coming out above the ridgeline. "There are people in this valley who are losing their land right now," Ethan said. "Tonight, while we're sitting on this porch." "Yes." "The Hendersons. You said they have a fraudulent lien. Blackwell's man served it 3 weeks ago. They have 60 days before the foreclosure proceeding." 60 days, he said. He looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains. "And the closest federal jurisdiction would be Denver," she said. "But there's a circuit court judge, Clarence Whitmore, who comes through Summit County twice a year. He's due in Hadley Creek in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He said it like he was measuring it. Like he was a man who measured things. The documents in that envelope would be sufficient to support a petition for federal investigation, Abigail said carefully. Combined with sworn testimony from current witnesses, the family's Blackwell has threatened anyone who's willing to come forward. It could be enough to stop the foreclosure proceedings and trigger a federal land fraud inquiry. Could be, he said. Could be, she agreed. I won't promise you certainty. I'm not in the business of false promises. He almost smiled at that. Almost. No, he said. I don't imagine you are. He stood up. The leather envelope was still under his arm. He looked down at her and she looked up at him, and the porch between them felt like a border of some kind, some line that hadn't been crossed yet. I'm going to put you up in the cabin tonight, he said. You need to rest that ankle. I'll sleep in the barn. Ethan, you don't have to. I'll be closer to the horses if anyone comes up the trail tonight, he said. It's practical. He paused. Can you make it inside on your own, or do you need a hand? I can manage, she said. And he watched her leverage herself up carefully, testing the ankle, setting her weight on it with cautious deliberation. She picked up the papers from her lap and began refolding them with that same methodical care. Miss Carter, he said. She looked up. Abigail. He held her gaze. I want you to know what your uncle did, what he said at that inquiry. I don't hold it against you. Whatever he was, you're not him. And what you've done traveling 4 months and fighting your way up that trail with a bad ankle to bring those documents here. He stopped, started again. It took something. I want you to know I see that. Something moved across her face. Something that had been held back for a long time, that gave just a fraction at those words before she pulled it back into steadiness. It seemed like the right thing to do, she said quietly. Most right things cost something, he said. Doesn't make them less right. He tipped his hat to her, an old gesture automatic, the kind of thing his mother had drilled into him as a boy, and that 7 years of solitude hadn't managed to shake loose. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning. He walked off the porch toward the barn. Behind him, he heard her move inside, heard the cabin door close. He stood in the dark of the barn, his hand on the neck of his horse, and opened the leather envelope in the dim light of his lantern. He read for a long time. He read the letters. He read the affidavits. He read the surveyor's records and the land filing documents, and the sworn correction from Robert Carter, written in the shaky hand of a sick man trying to put something right before he ran out of time. He read the document that recorded what had happened at Clearwater. He read his own name, what they had said about him, what had been said in rooms where he wasn't present by men who'd decided he was a useful tool for their absolution. He hadn't cried in 7 years. He didn't cry now, but he sat on the barn floor with his back against the stall door and his horse's nose warm and curious against the top of his head, and he breathed through it the way he'd learned to breathe through it, slowly and deliberately and without looking away. When he was done, he folded the documents back into the envelope. He sat there for a while longer in the quiet. Then he said to no one in particular, to the horse, to the mountains, to whatever portion of himself had been waiting a long time for permission to wake back up, "All right." Just that. All right. The barn was quiet around him. Somewhere up the slope in the cabin he'd built with his own hands, Abigail Carter was sleeping with her ankle wrapped in his cloth and 4 months of hard determination finally given a place to rest. And somewhere down in the valley, Jonathan Blackwell's men were moving in the dark. Ethan Walker picked up his lantern, stood up, and began to think. He was up before the sun. That wasn't unusual. Ethan had been waking before dawn for 7 years, ever since the nightmares had trained him to stop trusting sleep past a certain hour. But this morning was different. This morning, he hadn't slept at all. He'd spent the night in the barn with the documents and his thoughts. And by the time the first gray light started coming through the gaps in the barn wall, he'd read every page in that envelope twice and made a decision he hadn't entirely made yet, but could feel taking shape, the way weather takes shape, the pressure, changing the air, going still in a particular way that meant something was coming, whether you were ready for it or not. He heard her moving inside the cabin around sunrise. He gave her time. He fed the horses, drew water from the well, and built the morning fire outside rather than go into the cabin before she was ready. He had coffee on and a pan of salt pork by the time the cabin door opened, and she appeared in the doorway, one hand on the frame, testing her weight on the wrapped ankle. "Don't," he said, without looking up from the fire. "I'm fine." "You're stubborn," he said. "That's different from fine." She came out anyway carefully and lowered herself onto the porch step, and he brought her coffee without being asked. She took it with both hands and drank without saying thank you, which he respected, the kind of person who says thank you for everything, doesn't really mean it for anything. "How's the ankle?" he asked. "Manageable." "That means it hurts." "That means it's manageable." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Did you sleep?" "Some," he said, which was close enough to a lie that it probably counted as one, but she didn't push it. "You read them," she said. "The documents." "All of them." She waited. "Your uncle's affidavit," he said. "The one correcting his testimony." He kept his eyes on the fire. "He wrote that he heard me arguing with Blackwell's foreman before the column moved, that he saw me physically restrained." Yes, that detail wasn't in anything else. Not in any of the inquiry documents. Nobody else mentioned it. No. Which means he was the only witness to that specific moment, Ethan said. And he kept it to himself for 8 years. Abigail was quiet. She held the coffee cup in both hands, and she didn't try to explain her uncle, or excuse him, or soften what he'd done. That mattered to Ethan more than she probably knew the not softening. "I'm not going to pretend that's all right," he said finally. "What he did. What it cost people. But I read what he wrote at the end, and I believe he meant it. A man who didn't mean it wouldn't have given you those papers. He'd have burned them." "I've thought about that too," she said. "So I'm going to let it be what it is," he said. "And I'm going to deal with what's in front of me." She looked up at him. "You've decided something," she said. "I decided I'm not going to sit up here on this mountain and watch Blackwell run families off their land with documents I'm holding that could stop him." He said it flat. No drama in it, the way you say a thing when you've been turning it over long enough that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the only possible next step. "That's not a decision I can live with." Abigail Carter let out a breath, slow, controlled, the kind of breath that says a person has been holding something for a long time, and has finally been allowed to put it down. "Okay," she said quietly, "but I want to be clear about something." He turned to look at her directly. "I'm not picking up a gun. I'm not riding into Hadley Creek to settle old scores. If we do this, we do it right. We build a case, we find witnesses. We get those documents in front of Judge Whitmore, and we let the law do what the law is supposed to do. I've seen what happens when men decide to solve things with violence. I'm not going back to that." "I never asked you to," she said. "I know you didn't." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you, because I need you to understand what kind of man you're working with. I'm not a weapon, Miss Carter. I'm not going to become one again, not even for a good reason." "Ethan," she said, "the reason I came 4 months and 2 miles on a broken ankle to find you was because the documents in that envelope prove you were the only man in this story who refused to become a weapon when someone tried to make you one." She said it simply, like she was stating something obvious. "That's exactly the kind of man I need." He looked at her for a moment. Then, he picked up his coffee and turned back to the fire, because there was only so much of that kind of thing a man could take before he needed to look at something that wasn't looking back at him. "Tell me about the Henderson family," he said. She told him. Margaret Henderson was 63, a widow, 8 years running, who had worked her cattle ranch with her 2 sons for the better part of 2 decades. The lean Blackwell's man had served 3 weeks ago, cited a debt from a bank loan that Margaret Henderson had never taken out a loan that had supposedly been processed through the Summit County Land and Commerce Bank, which had been quietly purchased by one of Blackwell's holding companies in 1876. "So he buys the bank," Ethan said. "He buys the bank," Abigail confirmed. "And then the bank's records show loans that were never made. Loans with interest and penalties and legal fees attached. By the time the families realize what's happened, they owe more than the land is worth." "And the local sheriff?" Abigail's expression said everything her words hadn't gotten to yet. "Roy Dugan has been Summit County Sheriff for 6 years. He was appointed, not elected. Blackwell's man on the county board put him in the position. Dugan won't help." "Dugan is the one who serves the liens," she said. "Personally, he rides out himself." Ethan set down his coffee cup. "So the law in this county is his?" "Down in the valley, yes. Up here." She looked at him. "You're outside his jurisdiction, technically. The mountain claims are filed under different county boundaries. It's part of why Blackwell hasn't come for this land yet." "Part of why," Ethan said. "What's the other part?" "He didn't know you were here," she said. "You've been very careful about that. But Ethan, those men who ran my wagon yesterday knew my destination. If they were Blackwell's men, and I believe they were, then he knows now." That settled between them like a stone into water. "How long do you think we have before he moves?" Ethan asked. "I don't know, but I don't think it's long." He stood up. "Then we don't have time to sit still." He looked down at her. "Can you ride?" "With this ankle, I can tie the foot to the stirrup. It won't be comfortable, but it'll hold." She considered that for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes," she said. "I can ride." "Good, because we're going to go see Margaret Henderson today." Abigail looked at him. "Today. If Blackwell knows I'm here, then Blackwell knows I have these documents by now, which means the clock on those 60 days just got shorter." He picked up his hat from the post where he'd hung it. "Margaret Henderson needs to know there's someone fighting back. And I need to know what other families are in the same position, how many, and whether any of them are willing to stand up and say so in front of a federal judge." "They're afraid, Ethan. After what happened to Jerome Calloway." "I know they're afraid," he said. "I was afraid for 7 years. Fear's a reasonable response to a dangerous situation. But fear doesn't have to be the last thing a person feels." He settled the hat on his head. "Let me go saddle the horses." The ride down to the valley took the better part of an hour, and Abigail made it without complaint, though he could see the effort it cost her every time the trail got rough. He set a careful pace and watched her from the corner of his eye, the way he'd been watching her since the moment he found her on that trail, with an attention he wasn't entirely comfortable with, the kind of attention that meant something he wasn't ready to name. She caught him looking once. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't checking." "You were absolutely checking." He didn't argue. The Henderson ranch sat in a long flat meadow where the valley widened, and even from a distance, something about it looked tired. Not neglected exactly, but pressed down the way a person looks when they've been carrying something heavy for too long. Margaret Henderson met them in the yard. Before they'd dismounted, a short, broad-shouldered woman with white hair pinned back hard, and eyes that had seen enough trouble to know more when it was riding toward her. She looked at Ethan first, then at Abigail, then back at Ethan. "Ethan Walker," she said. It wasn't surprise exactly, more like recognition of something she'd been half expecting. "Word travels in these mountains even to hermits. I knew you were up on that east ridge." "Mrs. Henderson," he said, touching his hat. "I'm sorry to come unannounced." "Are you here about the lien?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." Something in her face shifted. Not hope exactly, because hope was something you had to be careful with when you'd had it knocked down enough times. More like the refusal to stop hoping even when you knew better. "Come inside," she said. Her younger son Thomas was inside, 24 years old, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he stood up when Ethan walked in with the posture of a young man who'd been waiting for something to fight and hadn't had anywhere to point it yet. He looked at Ethan the way young men look at older ones when they're trying to determine whether they're worth trusting. "You're the man from the mountain," Thomas said. "I am," Ethan said. "People say different things about you," Thomas said. "Thomas," his mother said quietly. "No, he can say it," Ethan said. He pulled out the chair across from Thomas and sat down, and he put the leather envelope on the table between them. "People say I ordered the massacre at Clearwater, that I was court-martialed, that I'm a dangerous man who ran away into the mountains because I knew what I'd done." He held Thomas Henderson's gaze. "Is that what you've heard?" Thomas's jaw worked. "Something like that." "It's not true," Ethan said, "and I can prove it." He nodded toward the envelope. "But whether you believe me or not, doesn't change why I'm here. I'm here because the same man who framed me is currently stealing your mother's land with a fake loan document, and I intend to do something about that if your family is willing to help me do it." Thomas looked at the envelope, then at Ethan, then at his mother. Margaret Henderson sat down at the head of her table with the steadiness of a woman who'd been making hard decisions alone for 8 years. "Tell us," she said. Ethan told them. He laid it out plainly. The documents, what they proved about Blackwell. The circuit court judge coming through Hadley Creek in 6 weeks, what it would take to bring a federal land fraud case. He didn't dress it up, and he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He said it was risky, that Blackwell had resources and connections, and had already shown he was willing to go further than most men would go. He said Jerome Calloway's name out loud, and didn't look away from Thomas when he said it. Thomas's hands were flat on the table. "So we stand up and we might end up like Calloway." "There's that risk," Ethan said. "Yes." "And if we don't stand up?" "You lose the ranch in 60 days, Ethan said, "and the next family after you loses theirs, and the one after that. And Blackwell keeps going until there's nobody left in this valley who isn't either working for him or gone." The silence in that kitchen had weight. Then Thomas Henderson said, "What do you need from us?" Margaret put her hand over her son's on the table. She looked at Ethan. "There are others," she said. "The Brewers up the North Creek. The Pattersons, they got a lien served last week you might not have heard. And old Silas Drummond, he's been fighting a mining claim dispute with Blackwell's company for 2 years. He knows things about how they operate that we don't." She paused. "They're scared. Same as we've been scared. But scared people will move if someone gives them something to move toward." "That's why we're here," Abigail said from beside Ethan. She'd been quiet through most of it, letting him lead, but she leaned forward now. "Mrs. Henderson, my name is Abigail Carter. My uncle was Robert Carter Blackwell's former land surveyor. Before he died, he put together documentation that corroborates everything Ethan just told you and more. Combined with testimony from your family and the others about the fraudulent liens, we have enough to compel a federal investigation. But we need people willing to give sworn statements. Margaret Henderson studied Abigail with the thoroughness of a woman who'd learned to read people out of necessity. "You've come a long way for this," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Abigail didn't hesitate. "Because my family helped create this problem, and I intend to help fix it." Something in Margaret Henderson's face settled into something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was pointed in that direction. "All right," she said. "I'll talk to the Brewers and the Pattersons. You talk to Silas Drummond. He won't come easy, but he responds to plain speaking, and from what I can see, you're a plain-speaking man." She looked at Ethan. "Give me 3 days." "Can you give me 3 days?" "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. "But I need you to be careful. Don't talk to anyone you don't absolutely trust. Don't put anything in writing. And if any of Blackwell's men come around asking questions—" "I've been handling Blackwell's men for 3 weeks," she said with a dryness that made Thomas almost smile for the first time. "I expect I can manage 3 more days." Ethan stood and picked up the envelope. Thomas Henderson rose with him, and they stood for a moment, the two of them, across the table. "I'm sorry about Jerome Calloway," Ethan said. Thomas's jaw tightened. "He was my best friend since we were 8 years old." "I know." He met the young man's eyes. "What we're doing, it's going to be done right, or it's not going to be done at all. I want you to hear me say that. No one else gets hurt because of how we handle this. Can you promise that?" Thomas said, and his voice had something raw in it, the grief he was wearing like a shirt that didn't fit yet. Ethan didn't look away. "I can promise you I'll do everything in my power to make it true," he said. "That's the only honest thing I can promise any man." Thomas Henderson held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once and stepped back. They rode back up toward the mountain with the afternoon light going long and warm across the valley, and Ethan held himself to that careful pace again and tried not to think about the way Thomas Henderson had looked when he said Jerome Calloway's name, and mostly didn't succeed. "You handled that well," Abigail said after a while. "I told the truth," he said. "That's not handling anything. That's just the minimum." "You'd be surprised how rarely people manage the minimum," she said. He glanced at her. "How's the ankle?" "I told you." "I'm going to keep asking," he said. "You might as well get used to it." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between exasperation and something warmer that she wasn't quite ready to show him yet. "It aches," she said finally, satisfied. "I will be when you're off it," he said. "We'll stop at the creek on the way back." She didn't argue, which told him more about how much it was actually hurting than anything she'd said. They found Silas Drummond the next morning. He was a leather-faced man of somewhere between 60 and 110, with a beard that had made its own decisions years ago, and a mining claim up the North Fork that he'd been working alone since his partner died in the early 70s. He met them at his claim gate with a rifle held loose in one hand, not threatening exactly, just present the way a man's rifle is present when he lives alone in the mountains and has learned not to be careless about it. "Ethan Walker," he said. "Silas," Ethan said. "Heard you took in a woman." "Word does travel," Ethan said. "This the woman?" Silas looked at Abigail with the unfiltered assessment of a man who'd stopped pretending to have manners somewhere around 1865. "Abigail Carter," Abigail said, before Ethan could make the introduction. "My uncle was Robert Carter. He worked for Jonathan Blackwell." Silas went very still. His eyes moved from Abigail to Ethan and back. "Robert Carter's dead," he said. "Yes," she said. "He is. And before he died, he put together a record of every fraudulent transaction Blackwell has run in this territory for the last 8 years. I have those records. We're building a federal case." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered the rifle to his side. "You'd better come in," he said. What Silas Drummond knew could have filled a second envelope. He'd been fighting Blackwell's mining company over a contested claim for 2 years, and in the course of that fight, he'd talked to every assayer, every land agent, and every disgruntled former employee of Blackwell's operation he could find. He had names, dates. He had the name of a man who'd personally witnessed the falsification of 3 separate land survey documents. He had the name of a bank clerk in Denver who'd been pressured to process the fraudulent loan records and had quietly quit rather than continue, and who Silas believed was still living in Denver and might be willing to talk. "A bank clerk," Abigail said, sitting forward. "That's direct evidence of the fraudulent lending scheme. If we can get a statement from him..." "Getting a statement from a man who's afraid of Blackwell is a different thing from knowing his name," Silas said. "I'll go to Denver," Abigail said. "Abigail?" Ethan said. "I'll go to Denver," she repeated with the particular calmness she used when she'd made a decision and wasn't entertaining arguments about it. "I know how to talk to frightened people. I've spent 4 months doing nothing but talking to frightened people." She looked at Ethan. "You stay here, keep building the witness group, make sure the families don't lose their nerve. I'll go to Denver, find the clerk, and come back with his statement before Judge Whitmore arrives." "Those men who ran your wagon," Ethan said. "They're still out there." "I know. Blackwell knows what you look like." "I know that too." She met his eyes without flinching. "I'll be careful. I've been careful for 4 months. And you ended up in a ditch 2 miles from my ranch." The bluntness of it landed, but she didn't look away. "I got here," she said. He held her gaze. There was something in his chest that had been getting louder since yesterday morning, and he was doing his level best to keep it quiet because it was not a useful thing to feel right now, and he was a practical man who dealt in what was useful. "I'll take you to the stage road," he said finally. "And I want you to have someone with you in Denver. Is there anyone you trust there?" She thought for a moment. "A woman I know. Clara Fitch. She was a school teacher. She moved to Denver 2 years ago. She's sensible, and she's discreet." "Contact her first," he said. "Don't go anywhere in that city alone." "Ethan." Her voice had gone quiet. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. And then, because he was going to say the practical thing and not the other thing, "You're the only person who's read all of those documents front to back and understands the legal architecture of what Blackwell has been doing. If something happens to you, we lose half the case. So I need you to be careful, for practical reasons." Silas Drummond was looking at the ceiling with an expression of studied neutrality that suggested he had heard and processed everything Ethan had just said, and was being very decent about not commenting on it. Abigail looked at Ethan for a moment. Then she said, "For practical reasons. Of course." And something in her voice that might have been amusement, quiet, and kept mostly to itself, made Silas Drummond find something very interesting to look at out the window. She left the next morning. Ethan rode with her to the stage road, and when the stage pulled away in a dust cloud, and she was visible through the window for exactly 4 seconds before the road curved, sitting straight, her hands in her lap, not looking back, he sat on his horse for longer than he needed to, and then turned back toward the mountain. He had work to do. He visited the Brewer family that afternoon. Ruth Brewer was 47, strong as wire, with 4 children ranging from 9 to 19, and she cried for about 30 seconds when Ethan explained what he had and what he intended to do with it, and then she stopped crying and asked him what she needed to sign and when. He found the Pattersons the day after. Henry Patterson was 62 and had a bad hip that made every step visible, and he listened to everything Ethan said without interrupting once, and when Ethan was done, he said, "I always knew something was wrong with that loan document. My signature's on it, and I never signed a thing." He looked at Ethan with the steady eyes of a man who'd been waiting for someone to tell him he wasn't crazy. "Tell me where to be and when, and I'll be there." On the 3rd day, Margaret Henderson called a meeting. She'd gotten word to 6 families, and they came. 7 adults sitting around the Hendersons' kitchen table and spilling into the hallway talking quietly with the particular hushed energy of people who have been afraid together and are considering the possibility of being brave together instead. Ethan talked, answered questions. He was honest about the risks, and when Thomas Henderson repeated his question from 3 days ago, "Can you promise no one else gets hurt?" Ethan gave him the same answer, and this time Thomas nodded without the grief in it that he'd had before. Not because the grief was gone, but because it had somewhere to go now. Walking back to his horse after the meeting, Margaret Henderson caught his arm. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "Roy Dugan came through here yesterday, asking questions. Asking if anyone had seen a woman traveling alone, and if I'd had any visitors from up the mountain." Ethan went still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I hadn't had any visitors since my son's birthday in April." She looked at him. "But Ethan Dugan doesn't go door to door asking questions on his own initiative. Blackwell sent him." "I know. That means Blackwell is moving faster than we thought." "I know that too." He put his hat back on. "How long ago was this?" "Yesterday afternoon." Ethan did the math. Abigail had been on the stage for 2 days. She'd be in Denver by now or close, which meant she was probably safe for the moment, which meant the immediate problem was here. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "if Dugan comes back, you don't know anything, and you haven't made any decisions. You're a frightened widow just trying to keep her ranch." "I am a frightened widow trying to keep her ranch," she said. "I'm just not only that." "No," he said, "you're not." He touched his hat to her. 3 weeks, he said. Stay steady. He rode back up to the mountain in the early evening, and the cabin was quiet and different in a way he hadn't expected. Not empty exactly because it had been empty for 7 years, and he knew what that felt like, but specific. The way a room feels different when someone has recently been in it who shouldn't have been there and now wasn't there anymore, and you feel both things at once. He checked the perimeter. He checked it twice. He took his rifle to the porch and sat with it across his knees in the dark, watching the tree line, and thought about Blackwell and 6 families and a circuit court judge who was 5 weeks and 4 days out. He thought about Abigail Carter on that stage, sitting straight, not looking back. He thought about what she'd said on the porch that first morning, that she'd come looking for him, because the documents proved he was the one man in the story who had refused to become a weapon. He turned that over in his mind, the way you turn something over when you're trying to figure out where it settles. He'd spent 7 years telling himself that the decision to come up this mountain was about peace, about leaving violence behind, about becoming a different kind of man. But sitting on that porch in the dark with his rifle across his knees and 6 families in the valley who were counting on him to hold this together, he had to be honest with himself about something. The difference between a man who had found peace and a man who was hiding from himself was whether he could still stand up when something real required it. Clearwater had broken something in him. That was true. But the breaking wasn't what he'd been punishing himself for up here on this mountain. The breaking was just the breaking. What he'd been punishing himself for was something older than that, the idea that maybe the world was right about him. That maybe a man who'd been in the middle of something terrible, even if he hadn't caused it, had something in him that deserved all the silence and the solitude and the forgetting. Abigail Carter had come 4 months and 2 miles with a broken ankle to hand him proof that the world had been wrong about him. And he was just beginning to understand that the harder thing she'd actually given him was permission to be wrong about himself. An owl called somewhere in the trees above the cabin. The summer night moved around him warm and full of small sounds. His horse shifted in the barn, and down at the edge of the property along the logging trail where he'd found her on her knees 3 days ago, something moved in the tree line. Ethan was off the porch before the thought was fully formed, rifle in hand, moving in the dark with the careful silence of a man who'd spent years learning which boards creaked and which shadows hid what. He reached the tree line in under a minute. 2 horses tied to a pine. No riders. He turned back toward the cabin. The front door was standing open. He hadn't left it open. Ethan Walker moved fast and low through the dark toward his own front door, and the quiet night around him had gone the particular kind of still that meant something was very wrong, and the voice in the back of his head that he'd been trying to silence for 7 years, the voice that had kept him alive through worse situations than this, was suddenly very, very awake. The door was open 3 inches. Ethan pressed his back against the outer wall and listened. Inside, 2 sets of breathing, both trying to be quiet, and neither quite managing it. The particular stillness of men who are waiting for something and are trying not to move while they wait. He'd built this cabin himself. He knew every sound it made. He came through the door low and fast, and the first man never had time to turn around before Ethan had the rifle barrel pressed to the back of his neck and his voice in the room like a cold blade. "Put it on the floor." The man, thick, short, with the kind of hands that said he worked for a living, but not at anything honest, dropped his pistol. It hit the floorboards with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The second man was across the room, and he'd gotten his weapon up, and for a half-second, the room held itself perfectly still, the three of them in a triangle of bad options. And then Ethan said without raising his voice at all, "You pull that trigger, and the sound will bring every man in this valley up that mountain, and you'll be explaining to all of them why you broke into a private residence. Put it down or don't. Your choice." The second man, younger, with nervous eyes that kept moving to his partner on the floor, made the calculation that smarter men than him had made in similar situations. He set the pistol on the table. "Good," Ethan said. "Now both of you are going to sit down and tell me who sent you." The short one, still on his knees, tried the obvious first. "We got lost. You tied your horses a quarter-mile down the trail and came up on foot in the dark," Ethan said. "Try again." Silence. "Blackwell," the younger one said, and the short one's head snapped toward him with the look of a man who'd just watched his partner make a fatal error. "That's better," Ethan said. "What were you sent here for?" "The envelope," the younger one said. He was talking now, and he wasn't going to stop. Ethan could see that some people break all at once when the situation turns against them. "Blackwell wants the documents. He just wants the papers. We were told to come get them and go. Nobody was supposed to get hurt." "You ran a woman's wagon off a cliff road 2 days ago," Ethan said. The younger one's mouth opened and closed. That wasn't supposed to..." He stopped. "She wasn't supposed to be hurt, just delayed." "She walked 2 miles on a sprained ankle," Ethan said. "In the summer heat, with your horses behind her." He kept his voice level. "You want to tell me again that nobody was supposed to get hurt?" The young one had the decency to look at the floor. Ethan pulled the short one up by the collar and walked both of them to the door. "Collect your horses," he said. "Ride back to Blackwell and tell him you didn't find the documents. Tell him they weren't here." He held the short one's eyes. "And tell him something else. Tell him I know his name. Tell him I know what he did at Clearwater, and I can prove it, and I have 6 families in this valley ready to stand up and say so in front of a federal judge. You tell him that. Exactly that. Can you remember that?" The short one stared at him. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite fear, but the cousin of it. "You tell him," Ethan said again. "Word for word." They left. Ethan stood in his doorway and listened to the sound of their horses going down the trail, and kept listening until the sound was gone and the night was quiet again. Then he went inside, set the rifle by the door, and sat down at the table. His hands were steady. He looked at them for a moment, surprised by that. In the old days before Clearwater, before everything, he'd always been steadiest when things were most dangerous. He'd thought he'd lost that. He'd thought he'd lost a lot of things. He'd just sent a message to Jonathan Blackwell, which meant everything that happened next was going to happen faster. He went to work. The next morning, he rode to the Hendersons before sunrise and told Thomas what had happened. Thomas listened with his jaw tight and his hands loose in that particular way of young men holding themselves very carefully in check. "So he sent men to your house," Thomas said. "He's not going to stop," Ethan said. "We knew that. This just confirms the timeline." He looked at Thomas. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to ride to the Brewers and the Pattersons today. Not tomorrow. Today. Tell them we're moving the timeline up. Whatever Blackwell does next, we need to be further along than he expects us to be." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go see Roy Dugan," Ethan said. Thomas blinked. The sheriff. The sheriff. "Ethan Dugan is Blackwell's man. You said yourself." "I know what Dugan is," Ethan said. "But there's something I've been thinking about. Blackwell uses people. He's been using Dugan the same way he used your lien, the same way he used my name after Clearwater as a tool. And tools have a limit. He settled his hat. I want to look Dugan in the eyes and see where his limit is. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. That sounds like a way to get yourself arrested. It might be, Ethan said, but I reckon it's worth finding out. Roy Dugan's office was in Hadley Creek, a 2-hour ride down the mountain, and Ethan made it in an hour and 40 minutes because the morning was cool and he pushed the pace. He tied his horse in front of the sheriff's office and walked in without knocking. Dugan was at his desk, a medium-built man of 50, with a carefully tended mustache and the eyes of someone who had made a series of decisions he was still trying to convince himself were reasonable. He looked up when Ethan came in, and his hand moved toward his desk drawer, and then stopped. Ethan Walker, he said. Flat. No question in it. Sheriff? Ethan pulled the chair across from the desk and sat without being invited. I think we should talk. I think you should state your business and then leave, Dugan said. My business is Jonathan Blackwell, Ethan said, and yours is too, whether you want to say so out loud or not. Something shifted in Dugan's face. Fast, quickly controlled, but Ethan caught it. I don't know what you... Roy. Ethan leaned forward. He hadn't used the man's first name on purpose. He watched Dugan register. It watched it do what he wanted it to do. Pull the conversation out of the formal and into the real. I've got documented evidence of federal land fraud. I've got a chain of forged loan documents traceable directly to a bank Blackwell owns. I've got sworn testimony from a former employee about falsified survey records. And I've got a circuit court judge coming through this county in 5 weeks. He paused. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because I think you're a man who's been in a situation that got away from him, and I think you know it, and I think you've been waiting for someone to come through that door and give you a reason to do the right thing. Dugan was very still. I'm wrong. You tell me to leave, and I'll go, Ethan said. But if I'm right, if any part of what I just said lands in a place you recognize, then you need to think very carefully about where you want to be standing when this comes apart. Because it is coming apart, Roy, with or without you. The clock on the wall ticked. Dugan said, Get out of my office. Ethan stood. All right. He settled his hat. Think about what I said. I said get out. Ethan left. He rode back toward the mountain in the afternoon heat, turning the conversation over. Dugan had told him to leave. But Dugan hadn't arrested him, and Dugan's hand had never finished its move toward that desk drawer. A man with nothing to hide and full confidence in his position would have done one or the other. Dugan had done neither. He was halfway up the mountain when he heard the rider behind him. He didn't stop or turn. Just adjusted his grip and kept riding and waited. The rider came up alongside him and matched his pace, and Ethan looked over to find a young deputy he didn't know, 20 or so, with dust on his jacket and something urgent in his face. Mr. Walker, the deputy said. Son, Ethan said, Sheriff Dugan sent me. The deputy was looking straight ahead, like he was afraid of being seen talking to Ethan even out here in the middle of nowhere. He said to tell you. Blackwell's got a man named Calhoun, Cole Calhoun. He runs Blackwell's enforcement operation. Dugan said Calhoun was in his office this morning 2 hours before you were. He said, the deputy swallowed. He said Calhoun knows about the documents. He said Calhoun knows a woman is carrying them, and he knows she went to Denver. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. Dugan said that's all he's going to say, the deputy finished. He said he didn't tell you anything, and this conversation didn't happen. Tell the sheriff I understand, Ethan said, keeping his voice very even. And tell him I won't forget what he did here. The deputy peeled off and rode back toward town, and Ethan sat on his horse in the middle of the mountain road for 5 seconds, with the information settling over him like cold water. Calhoun knew Abigail had gone to Denver. He turned his horse and rode hard. He made Silas Drummond's claim in 20 minutes and was off the horse before it fully stopped. Silas came out with the rifle and lowered it when he saw who it was. I need to send a telegram, Ethan said. Who in Hadley Creek can I trust to send one without Blackwell's people knowing about it? Silas thought for exactly 3 seconds. Mabel Grice at the dry goods. She's been at war with Blackwell's company since they tried to buy her building in 1875. She'll send it quiet. Will she be there now? If she's not, her daughter will. Ethan was back on his horse. Send word to the Hendersons. Tell Thomas I need him to stay close to home tonight and keep his eyes open. He wheeled the horse. I'll be back before dark. He sent the telegram to Abigail. Care of Clara Fitch's address, which Abigail had given him before she left. He'd made her give it to him, and she'd sighed, but provided it. And he was grateful now for the stubbornness that had made him ask. The telegram was short. It said, Calhoun knows. Be careful who you talk to. Don't go anywhere without Clara. Send word when you have the statement. He gave Mabel Grice $2, and she looked at him like he was trying to insult her and handed one back. Keep your money, she said. I know who you are, and I know what's in those papers. Word gets around. She fixed him with a look that reminded him of his grandmother in the best possible way. You bring that man down, Mr. Walker. You bring him all the way down. That's the plan, ma'am, he said. He made it back to the mountain by evening. No response from Abigail by the next morning. He told himself the telegram might not have reached her yet. He told himself she was sensible and careful, and had survived 4 months of this alone before she'd ever found him. He told himself all the practical things. He went and helped Thomas Henderson mend a section of fence that had nothing to do with anything except that he needed to do something with his hands. Thomas worked beside him without talking much, which Ethan appreciated. At one point, the younger man said, "She'll be all right." Ethan kept working. "She's capable," he said. "That's not what I asked." Ethan looked at him. Thomas was looking at the fence post with something like a carefully neutral expression. "I just meant she seems like the kind of person who lands on her feet." "She does," Ethan said. "So she'll be all right." Ethan drove the post into the ground with more force than strictly necessary. "Yes," he said. "She will." Thomas didn't say anything else about it. The response came the afternoon of the second day, delivered by the stage that came through the North Road and dropped mail at the Henderson Ranch, which was the closest stop. Thomas wrote it up to Ethan at the cabin with an expression of studied casualness that didn't fool either of them. Ethan opened it. It was from Clara Fitch's address. It said, "Statement obtained. Clerk's name is Edmund Marsh. Signed affidavit confirming fabrication of loan records and Blackwell's direct involvement. Returning Thursday stage. Don't come to meet me. I'll find you." He read it twice. Then he sat down on the porch step and let out a breath that he felt had been building for 2 days. "Good news," Thomas said. "Very good news," Ethan said. "She got what she went for." "She got what she went for," Ethan said, and something in the way he said it made Thomas Henderson find something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. She arrived on Thursday. She didn't look like a woman who'd ridden 4 days of hard stage and spent 2 days convincing a frightened bank clerk to sign his name to a document that could get him killed. She looked like a woman who had done exactly those things and had decided they were done and she was moving forward. The only concession to any of it was that she was moving slightly carefully on the ankle, and when Ethan reached to help her down from the stage, she didn't argue about it the way she would have 3 days ago. "Edmund Marsh," she said before her feet were fully on the ground. 41 years old, 12 years as a bank clerk, worked for the Summit County Land and Commerce Bank from 1874 to 1876. He left because Blackwell's manager pressured him to process loan documents for borrowers who he'd never met and whose signatures were, his word, inconsistent. He kept copies of 3 of those documents. She held up a leather case that matched the envelope Ethan had been carrying for a week. He brought them. Ethan looked at her. "You're all right?" he said. Not a question, but not only a statement either. "I'm all right," she said. And then quietly, "I got your telegram. Thank you. I didn't want you walking into something unprepared." "I know." She met his eyes for a moment. "Clara says hello incidentally, and also that you're obviously a decent man and she's glad you exist." You talked to her about me. She asked questions. I answered them. She moved past him toward the horses, without quite hiding the smile that came and went. Can we go? I want to go through the new documents with you tonight and cross-reference with what we already have. They rode back towards the mountain, and the afternoon was warm and easy, and Ethan found himself doing the same thing he'd been doing since the night he'd found her on the trail, watching her from the edge of his attention. This woman who had arrived broken and scared at his door, and had not in the 8 days since then ever been anything other than more than he expected. She talked through the Marsh affidavit as they rode organized and precise, and he asked questions, and she answered them, and it felt like something he hadn't known he was missing, the simple, practical comfort of working alongside someone who was as serious about the work as he was. That night they spread everything across his kitchen table. Every document. The letters between Blackwell and Harlan Good. The land survey records Silas had provided. Robert Carter's corrected affidavit. The 6 family statements Thomas had helped collect. And now Edmund Marsh's 3 fabricated loan documents, each one bearing a borrower's signature, that Marsh had sworn in writing he'd never witnessed, and which showed signs to any trained eye of the same hand on every one. It's enough, Abigail said quietly, looking at the table. This is enough for Judge Whitmore. We need to make sure he sees it, Ethan said. We need someone to formally present the petition. There's a lawyer in Summit City, she said. His name is Arthur Hale. He's handled federal land cases before. He's not connected to Blackwell, I checked. She looked up. He's expensive. How expensive? She named a figure. Ethan looked at the table. The Hendersons would contribute, he said, thinking aloud. The Brewers. Silas has been sitting on that mining claim money for years. He doesn't spend anything. He looked up. It's manageable. I have some money, Abigail said. From my uncle's estate. It wasn't much, but... No, he said. Ethan, you've already given more to this than anyone here. He held her gaze. You don't owe this valley anything more than what you've already done. The people whose land is at stake, this is their fight to fund. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face that she didn't quite let become words. All right, she said finally. He was reaching to stack the documents when it happened. When the thing he'd been not quite thinking about and not quite feeling for. 10 days finally broke through the carefully maintained practical framework he'd been using to keep it at arm's length. She was reaching for the same stack of documents, and their hands met on the table, and she looked up, and he was already looking at her, and neither of them moved for a moment. That was precisely as long as it needed to be for both of them to understand what it was. Then Ethan moved his hand. I'll organize the Blackwell correspondence by date, he said. I'll do the loan documents, she said, and her voice was exactly as steady as his, which meant it was a little less steady than usual. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then Abigail said, without looking up from the papers, You know what Clara said when I told her how I found you? What did she say? She said a man who builds a home by himself in the mountains, and then the first person he finds half dead on his property, he brings inside and feeds and wraps her ankle and sleeps in the barn, so she feels safe. Abigail paused. She said that's not a dangerous man. She said that's a man who's been saving himself for something worth showing up for. Ethan was very still. I thought that was a perceptive thing for her to say, Abigail said with an evenness in her voice that was working harder than usual. Clara is a perceptive person. She sounds like it, he said. The table sat between them covered in documents that could take down a powerful man, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the thing that had been getting louder in Ethan's chest had a different quality now, the quality of something that had been named even if only sideways and only once. He was still sitting with that when the shot came through the window. Not a clean shot, more like a warning, the kind of thing a man fires when he wants you to know he's there, not when he's actually trying to hit you. The sound of it was enormous in the small room, and Abigail dropped below the table level before Ethan had even fully registered the sound, which told him things about her that he already knew, but found himself registering again with a particular fierce appreciation. Ethan had the lantern out in 2 seconds. The room went dark. "Stay down," he said quietly. "I am down," she said from under the table, with the particular dryness she produced under pressure that he was starting to find unreasonably steadying. He moved to the window. In the dark of the yard, 3 riders at the edge of where the shadows started, not bothering to hide. They wanted to be seen. One of them called out, "Walker." The voice was flat and professional, not angry, not threatening, just stating a fact the way a man states something when he's done it enough times that the doing of it no longer interests him. "That's Cole Calhoun," Abigail said softly from under the table. She'd recognized the voice, and the recognition had changed something in her breathing. Ethan heard it. "You know him," he said. "He came to my uncle's house," she said. "After my uncle died, before I left. He came looking for the documents." A pause. "He's not like the men he sent before." Ethan already knew that. You could tell from the voice. "Stay here," he said. "Ethan." He was already at the door. He came out onto the porch with his rifle and stood in the dark and looked at the 3 riders and said, "You fired on a private residence." "Warning shot," Calhoun said. He was a lean man on a dark horse, unhurried in the way of someone who didn't have to be hurried because he'd already won enough situations to know how they ended. "Mr. Blackwell would like his property returned." "He doesn't have any property here," Ethan said. "The documents Miss Carter is carrying belong to Mr. Blackwell's company." "They're sworn legal affidavits and notarized records," Ethan said. "They don't belong to anyone. They belong to the truth." A pause. "Mr. Walker," Calhoun said with a patience that was its own kind of threat. "You've been a very quiet man for a very long time. Mr. Blackwell has respected that. He's asking you to go back to being quiet." "And the Henderson family," Ethan said. "The Brewers, the Pattersons, the Callaways, whose patriarch is dead on a road he rode every day, he asking them to be quiet too." "Those are business matters." "Fraud isn't business," Ethan said. "It's a federal crime." Another pause, longer this time. "You don't want this fight," Calhoun said. "No," Ethan agreed. "I don't want it. I've been trying not to want it for 10 years. But here it is anyway." He held the man's gaze across the dark yard. "You ride back to Blackwell, and you tell him whatever he thought he bought in this county, he doesn't own the truth. He never did. And Judge Whitmore is going to know that in 4 weeks." Calhoun sat on his horse for a moment. Then he turned without another word, and the 3 riders went back into the dark, and the sound of them faded, and the night came back in around the cabin. Ethan stood on the porch until he was certain they were gone. Then he went back inside. Abigail was standing now, not under the table, her hands at her sides and her face in the dark, unreadable. He lit the lantern back up. She blinked in the light and looked at him. 4 weeks, she said. "You told him 4 weeks." "I wanted him to have a number," Ethan said. "I want Blackwell thinking about a deadline. Nervous men make mistakes." "Nervous men also make desperate moves," she said. "Yes," he said. "They do." He looked at the documents on the table. "Which is why we need to get those to Arthur Hale in Summit City by the end of the week." He looked at her. "And why you're not going anywhere alone until this is over." She looked at him steadily. "I can take care of myself." "I know you can," he said. "That's not the point." He held her gaze and let what he meant by it be in the room, not said exactly but present. "You asked me once why I built this place up on this mountain, what I was hiding from." "I didn't ask that." "You were thinking it," he said, and she almost smiled. "The answer is, I was hiding from the idea that anything I cared about could be taken from me again." He stopped, breathed. "I'm done with that hiding. But I'd like to do this right if you'll let me." Abigail Carter looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight with the documents between them, and 4 weeks until a federal judge arrived and a man named Calhoun riding back into the dark to report to a powerful man who was about to make his most dangerous moves. "All right, Ethan," she said quietly. "Let's do it right." Outside, the summer night pressed in around the cabin walls. And somewhere below in the valley, Jonathan Blackwell had just gotten a message that changed everything about how the next 4 weeks were going to go. They rode to Summit City the next morning, the two of them with the documents divided between 2 saddlebags, because Ethan had decided that putting everything in one place was a risk he wasn't willing to take anymore. Abigail had agreed without discussion, which was one of the things about her that he'd stopped noticing as unusual, and started noticing as simply how she was practical when practicality was needed. No energy wasted on arguing about the obvious. Arthur Hale's office was above a hardware store on the main street, and the man himself was younger than Ethan had expected, 35 maybe, with the careful eyes of someone who read everything twice and trusted almost nothing on first presentation. He looked at the documents for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, "Where did you get these?" "Does that matter?" Ethan said. "It matters for chain of custody," Hale said. "It matters for how I present them to Judge Whitmore. If there's any question about how these were obtained, they were obtained legally," Abigail said. "Each source is documented. My uncle's affidavit establishes his ownership of the Blackwell correspondence. Silas Drummond's materials were from his own private records. Edmund Marsh retained copies of the loan documents as part of his own professional record-keeping." She met Hale's careful eyes. Everything in those cases came from someone who had a legal right to possess it and a legal right to provide it. Hale looked at her. "You've thought about this." "For 4 months," she said. He looked back at the documents. He was quiet for a full 2 minutes, which Ethan respected. A man who talked while he was thinking wasn't actually thinking. "The Clearwater material," Hale said finally to Ethan. "This names you directly, as the man who was falsely accused." "Yes," Ethan said. "You understand that if I file this petition with Judge Whitmore, your name goes back into public record. Everything that was said about you at the inquiry and everything these documents say in rebuttal becomes part of the federal court record." He held Ethan's gaze. "There's no doing this quietly." "I know," Ethan said. "People in this territory have believed certain things about you for 7 years. I know that too. Some of them will keep believing it regardless of what any document says." "Mr. Hale," Ethan said, "I stopped needing people to believe the right thing about me a long time ago. What I need is for Blackwell to be stopped before he takes one more family's land. Whatever it costs me to make that happen, I'll pay it." Hale looked at him for another long moment. Then he turned to the documents and said, "All right. Tell me everything from the beginning in order. I'm going to take notes and I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and I need you both to answer them completely and honestly, even when the answer is complicated." "We can do that," Abigail said. They were in that office for 4 hours. When they came out, the afternoon was well advanced, and Ethan's horse was restless from standing, and Abigail was moving on the ankle with the slightly deliberate care that meant it had stiffened up during the long sitting. Ethan noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He brought her horse around and held it while she mounted, and didn't make it into a production, which seemed to be the right approach, because she let him do it without arguing. "He thinks we have a strong case," she said as they rode out. "He said probably strong," Ethan said. "For a lawyer, probably strong is very strong." He almost smiled at that. 3 weeks, he said. "We need to keep everyone steady for 3 weeks until Whitmore arrives. The families are steadier than you think," she said. "Margaret Henderson alone is enough to hold the rest of them together. That woman she's something, Ethan. She's been carrying all of this scared and alone, and she never once let it show to her sons. Women like that are why this country works," Ethan said. Abigail glanced at him. What an unexpectedly progressive thing for a mountain hermit to say. "I spent 7 years talking mostly to horses," he said. "They have no patience for nonsense. It clarifies your thinking." This time she laughed, a real one, quick and genuine, and it caught him off guard, the way things caught him off guard lately, that never used to the small sounds of her moving through what had been his entirely solitary life, rearranging its quiet into something with a different texture. They were 2 miles from the mountain road when they found Thomas Henderson waiting for them. He was sitting on his horse at the crossroads, with the look of a man who had been there for a while, and had news he hadn't wanted to send by anyone else. Ethan pulled up and read his face and felt his stomach drop before Thomas said a word. "What happened?" Ethan said. "Dugan came to the ranch this morning," Thomas said, "with 2 of Calhoun's men." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "They served an accelerated foreclosure notice. They're claiming the 60 days were miscounted from the original filing date, not the serving date. They're saying we have 9 days. 9 days. Ethan heard Abigail pull in a sharp breath beside him. "That's not legal," she said immediately. "The 60-day period runs from the date of service, not the filing. That's basic." "Blackwell's lawyer filed an amended motion this morning in Summit County Probate," Thomas said. "Dugan had a copy, all stamped and official looking." He looked at Ethan with something that wasn't quite desperation, but was right next to it. "Ma said to find you. She said you'd know what to do." Ethan looked at Thomas for a moment. Then he turned his horse around. "Where are you going?" Abigail said. "Back to Hale," he said. "He needs to know about the amended motion. He can file an emergency petition to stay the foreclosure pending the federal hearing." He looked back at her. "Ride Thomas home. Stay at the Henderson Ranch tonight, both of you. I'll be back before morning." "Ethan, it's already afternoon, you can't—" "I know it." He met her eyes. "I'll be fine. Stay with the Hendersons." A pause. "Please." The please was the thing. She heard it for what it was. "Before morning," she said. "Before morning," he said. He was back in Hale's office 40 minutes later, and Hale had the same 2-minute silence with the amended motion paperwork that he'd had with everything else. And then he said, "This is a pressure move. Blackwell knows his original timeline is compromised. He's trying to accelerate the foreclosure past the hearing date." "Can you stop it?" Ethan said. "I can file an emergency motion to stay," Hale said, "but I need to do it tonight before the Summit County Probate Office closes." He was already moving, reaching for his coat. "And Ethan, this motion is going to name Blackwell directly. It's going to allege fraud and petition for federal jurisdiction. Once I file this, there's no—" "File it," Ethan said. Hale looked at him. "You understand what I'm saying? You're saying once we start this officially, Blackwell knows exactly where we are and what we have," Ethan said. "He already knows. He sent Calhoun to my house 3 nights ago. He fired a shot through my window." He held Hale's gaze. "File it." Hale filed it. He made it back to the Henderson Ranch in the dark, and Abigail met him in the yard before he dismounted with the look of someone who had been waiting and was not going to say so. "Well," she said. "Filed," he said. "Motion to stay the foreclosure pending federal hearing." Hale said the probate judge, even if he's sympathetic to Blackwell, can't summarily dismiss a motion that's citing federal jurisdiction. It buys us time. Something left her shoulders. She'd been holding it there since Thomas had met them at the crossroads. "Come inside," she said. "Margaret made supper, and she won't let anyone not eat it." He ate at Margaret Henderson's table with Thomas and the 2 older Henderson sons, and Margaret sat at the head and watched everyone with the particular quality of attention of a woman who had been responsible for people for so long it had become the way she understood the world. She asked Ethan questions about Hale, about the motion, about what would happen next, and he answered all of them straight, and she nodded at each answer in the way of someone storing information for later use. At one point she said, "You know what my husband used to say about Jonathan Blackwell?" "What's that?" Ethan said. "He used to say a man who buys everything eventually convinces himself that everything has a price." She looked at Ethan steadily. "He was wrong about enough things in his life, my husband, God rest him, but he was right about that." Ethan nodded. "He couldn't buy you," she said. "Even when you were running from everything. He couldn't buy your silence because you'd already taken yourself somewhere he couldn't reach." She looked at him with the directness of someone who had nothing left to waste on indirection. "I want you to know, whatever happens with the hearing, whatever the judge decides this valley owes you something, it probably won't know how to say." "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Henderson," he said. "We owe you the truth," she said. "And the truth is, you didn't have to come down off that mountain. You didn't have to go see Dugan or ride back to Hale tonight or put your name back in a public record. You did it anyway." She reached across the table and put her hand over his for just a moment, the brief, certain gesture of a woman who meant what she did. "That matters." He couldn't answer that. He just nodded. Abigail was very quiet on the ride back up the mountain later, and Ethan let her be quiet because he was learning the difference between her different silences, the working ones when she was thinking something through, and the processing ones when something had landed in her that needed space. This was the second kind. Halfway up the trail, she said, "My uncle sat on those documents for 8 years. He waited. 8 years, she said again. 8 years of those families losing their land. 8 years of Jerome Calloway's death not meaning what it should mean. 8 years of you up on this mountain." She said it without self-pity, just the clean reckoning with it. "And I keep thinking if he'd just come forward, if he'd just—" "He was afraid," Ethan said. "I know he was afraid. I'm not angry at him for being afraid. She stopped. "I think about Margaret Henderson at that table. She's been afraid too. Every single day. And she got up every morning and kept going." "Fear doesn't disqualify you," he said. "It's what you do with it." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you figured out up here?" "That's what I'm still figuring out," he said. "Give me another 7 years." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then it faded and she said, "Ethan." "Yeah. Thank you." She said it simply, not wrapped in anything. "For not sending me away that first morning. For reading the documents. For all of it." He rode for a moment without answering. The mountain night was around them, warm and full of the sounds of summer, and the stars were out in the kind of density you only get at altitude. "You gave me something back," he said finally. "I don't know if you know that, but you did." She didn't ask him what. She seemed to understand what, or at least to know that the answer would find its way to words in its own time, and that forcing it before then would break something in it. They made it back to the cabin, and he checked the perimeter twice, and she didn't say anything about it, and he went to the barn, and she went to the cabin, and the mountain was quiet. 2 days later, Blackwell made his move. It didn't come the way Ethan had expected, not Calhoun and Riders, not another shot through the window. It came as a letter delivered by a man in a good suit who rode up to the cabin at noon and handed it over without expression, and rode back down without waiting for an answer. It was addressed to Ethan Walker and Abigail Carter jointly, which told him that Blackwell had been paying attention. He brought it inside, and they read it together at the table. It was written in the careful language of a man who had lawyers, but the meaning underneath the language was plain. Blackwell was offering to withdraw all foreclosure proceedings against all affected families in Summit County. He was offering to clear the fraudulent liens. He was offering in a separate provision that was carefully not called what it was, a payment to Ethan Walker of $12,000. In exchange, the federal petition would be withdrawn. The documents would be surrendered or destroyed, and Ethan Walker and Abigail Carter would leave Colorado Territory within 30 days. $12,000. Abigail set the letter down. "He's scared," she said. "He should be," Ethan said. $12,000 is a significant amount of money. She said it without inflection, just putting it in the room. "It is," he said. "And the families would get their land back. Under terms he controls," Ethan said. "With nothing on record. Nothing to stop him doing exactly this again in 5 years somewhere else to other people." He looked at her. "He's not offering this because he's had a change of heart. He's offering it because Arthur Hale's motion scared him, and he wants this to disappear before Whitmore arrives." "I know that," she said. "Then you know the answer." She looked at him. "I wanted to hear you say it." "No," he said. "The answer is no." She picked up the letter and folded it and set it aside. "I'll send word to Hale. He should know about this." "Tell him to put it in the file," Ethan said. "The fact that Blackwell is offering a bribe to drop a federal petition is its own kind of evidence." Hale's response came back. The next day, he agreed entirely, had noted the offer in the case record, and had received confirmation from Judge Whitmore's circuit office that the hearing date was set. 19 days. 19 days. The valley settled into a particular kind of tense waiting that Ethan recognized from his scouting days, the period before something happened when everyone knew something was going to happen, and the not knowing of exactly what or when made every ordinary moment feel charged. He visited each family twice that week. He sat with Silas Drummond and went through the mining claim documentation again. He helped Thomas Henderson repair the barn roof because it needed doing, and because Thomas needed something to do with his hands, same as Ethan did, and they worked side by side for a full afternoon, not talking much, which was its own kind of conversation. Abigail worked at this cabin table every day, organizing and cross-referencing, building the timeline of Blackwell's operations in the clear chronological order that Hale needed to present it. She had a system that Ethan didn't fully understand, but that produced results. He could see documents sorted, indexed, annotated in her small, neat handwriting with references to other documents, dates connected to names, connected to transactions in a web that was becoming very hard to dispute. She'd stay at it past dark sometimes, and he'd come in from the evening check and find her still at the table with the lantern burning, and he'd make coffee and set a cup beside her without saying anything, and she'd take it without looking up. And that small exchange happened 4 nights running, and each time it felt more like something that had always been there and less like something new. On the 5th evening, she looked up when he set the cup down and said, "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with Blackwell or Clearwater or any of this." He sat down across from her. "Like what?" "Anything," she said. "Tell me something ordinary." He thought for a moment. "I make bad bread," he said. "I've been trying to make a decent loaf for 3 years, and it comes out like something you'd use to shoe a horse." She blinked. Then she said, "Seriously, dead serious. I've tried 6 different methods. The horses won't even eat it." She pressed her lips together. "You built this entire cabin yourself. You track men through the dark in the mountains. You read legal documents and build federal cases, and you cannot make bread." "Nobody's good at everything," he said. She laughed full, this time unguarded, and she put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes went bright with it, and something settled in Ethan's chest so completely and quietly that he barely noticed it happening, like a door closing gently on a very long wind. "I can make bread," she said when she'd recovered. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know. You made some the second morning you were here. When I came in from the barn, the cabin smelled like—" He stopped. "I ate 3 pieces. I thought you were hungry," she said. "I was," he said. "That's not the only reason I ate 3 pieces." The lantern light held them both in its small, warm circle, and the documents were between them on the table, and outside, the summer night was breathing, and Abigail Carter looked at Ethan Walker across everything that had happened between the beginning and now, and said quietly, and without any of the armor she'd been carrying for as long as he'd known her, "What happens after Whitmore? After all of it," she said. "After the hearing and the families keep their land, and Blackwell faces what he should face." She was holding her coffee cup in both hands, the way she'd held it that first morning on the porch. "What happens to you?" He considered the question, the way he considered most things, straight on, without retreating from it. "I reckon I stay," he said. "This is my home. I know that." She looked at the table for a moment. "I asked what happens to you, not where you stay." He understood what she was asking. He understood it precisely, and the part of him that had been building walls for 7 years made one last careful argument for caution and silence. And he heard the argument out fully, and then set it aside. "I think," he said, "that depends on something I don't know yet." She looked up. "I think it depends," he said, "on whether the woman sitting across from me has any interest in knowing what Colorado looks like in the fall." Abigail held his gaze. Color came into her face slowly, the kind that comes when something you've been careful not to want becomes possible. "I've never seen Colorado in the fall," she said. "It's something," he said. "The aspens go. It's—" He stopped. He wasn't a man who described things easily, and he wasn't going to start now. "You'd have to see it." "I suppose I would," she said. The lantern burned between them. Then the sound of a horse came up the trail, fast, too fast. For this time of night, the rhythm of urgency in the hoofbeats, and both of them were on their feet before it stopped. Thomas Henderson came through the door without knocking, which told Ethan everything about the news before Thomas said a word. His face was white. "Calhoun's men took Silas Drummond," he said, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone reporting something so wrong it hasn't finished feeling real yet. "2 hours ago. Pulled him off his claim. They're saying he assaulted one of Blackwell's surveyors. They've got him in the Hadley Creek jail." Ethan had his hat off the hook before Thomas finished the sentence. "That's a fabricated charge," Abigail said. She was already at the table pulling Silas's file. "His testimony is critical to the mining claim portion of the petition. If Blackwell can discredit him or keep him locked up past the hearing date." "I know what it is," Ethan said. He looked at Thomas. "Who's in the jail besides Dugan's deputy on night watch?" "I don't know," Thomas said. "I rode straight here." Ethan looked at Abigail. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who was thinking 3 steps ahead and was about to say something he wasn't going to like. "I need to go to Hadley Creek tonight," she said. "Abigail, not to the jail," she said. "To the telegraph office. I need to send a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver. A false arrest of a material witness in a pending federal case is federal obstruction. If I can get a marshal moving tonight, he can be here before the hearing." She held his gaze. "Hale can't do it. He's in Summit City." "You can't do it. You walk into that telegraph office and Blackwell's people will know inside an hour. But I can ride in quietly, send the wire, and be back before midnight. And if Calhoun's men are watching the town, then I'll be careful." She was already moving. "Ethan, we are 14 days from that hearing. Blackwell just put one of our key witnesses in jail. If we don't respond tonight, we lose the momentum, and he knows it." She stopped in front of him. Close. Close enough that he could see exactly how steady she was, how certain. "Let me go." He stood there for one long moment, reading her face, running through every argument against it, and finding them all inadequate against the simple truth that she was right. "Thomas rides with you," he said. "Agreed. You send the wire, and you come straight back. No stopping. No talking to anyone in that town." "Agreed. And if anything feels wrong—" "We ride," she said. "I promise." He looked at her. Everything he wanted to say about it organized itself into the one thing that was the truth of all of it. "You come back," he said. She held his gaze. "I'll come back," she said. Quiet. Certain. The kind of promise a person makes when they understand the full weight of what they're promising. She and Thomas rode out. Ethan stood in the doorway of the cabin and listened to the hoofbeats until they faded, and then he went and saddled his own horse, because he was not a man who was going to stand still while the people he cared about were riding toward danger. He went a different way through the trees around the back of the mountain, the route he'd learned in 7 years of walking every inch of this land in every season and every weather. He came into the eastern edge of Hadley Creek quietly and tied his horse 3 streets back and walked the rest. The telegraph office was on the main street across from the jail. He found a shadow between 2 buildings with a line of sight to both, and he stood in it and he waited. He watched Abigail and Thomas come in from the north road and tie their horses and go into the telegraph office. He watched the clock in his head. 11 minutes long enough for a message short enough for nothing to go wrong. They came back out and Thomas said something and Abigail nodded and they went to their horses. And then the door of the jail opened and Calhoun walked out. He saw them immediately. Ethan was already moving. He came around the corner of the building and into the street, and Calhoun turned at the sound of his boots. And for a moment, the 4 of them were all in the same picture, Ethan and Calhoun and Abigail and Thomas, and the whole night holding its breath. "Walker," Calhoun said. "You have a man in that jail who hasn't done anything wrong," Ethan said. He kept his voice even. He kept his hands visible. "You know that, and I know that, and the U.S. Marshal's office is going to know it by morning. Something moved in Calhoun's face. "You're making this harder than it has to be," Calhoun said. "No," Ethan said. "I'm making it as hard as it needs to be." He held the man's gaze. "Let Silas Drummond go." "I don't have the authority." "Calhoun." The name came out flat and final. "You've been doing Blackwell's work for long enough to know how this ends when the federal government gets involved. You're not a stupid man. You know what obstruction of justice does to a man's prospects." He paused. "Let Silas go, tonight, and think very carefully about whether you want to be in this county when Judge Whitmore arrives." The street was very quiet. Calhoun stood for a long moment with the calculation of it moving behind his eyes, the kind of calculation that a man like him makes when the math starts changing and he has to decide how loyal his loyalty actually is. Then he turned and went back into the jail. Nobody moved. 3 minutes later, Silas Drummond came out of the jail door with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who'd expected to be in that cell a lot longer. He looked across the street and found Ethan, and his eyebrows rose, and he crossed without being asked and stood beside him. "Took you long enough," Silas said. "It's been 20 minutes, Ethan said. "Felt longer," Silas said. He looked at Abigail, then at Thomas, then at Calhoun's retreating back. "He's going to tell Blackwell." "I know," Ethan said. "So Blackwell's going to come himself," Silas said. "Man like that, when he's out of moves, he comes himself." "I know that too," Ethan said. Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he put his hat on. "All right then," he said. "Let's go home." They rode back to the mountain in a group, 4 of them, and nobody said much because the night was saying enough, the particular kind of alive that a summer night gets when things have shifted and everyone can feel it, and the next thing hasn't happened yet, but it's close. Abigail rode beside Ethan, and at one point her hand brushed his arm in the dark, brief, and light, and he didn't know if it was intentional or just the closeness of the trail, and she didn't say anything about it, and he decided that some things don't need to be examined. 13 days until Whitmore arrived. Blackwell was out of moves, and he knew it, which meant the most dangerous days were still ahead. But somewhere in the territory, a U.S. Marshal was reading a telegram, and 6 families in this valley were sleeping on land that wasn't going to be taken from them. And Silas Drummond was riding home with his hat on his head and his testimony intact, and Ethan Walker was riding through the summer mountain night with people beside him on both sides. That was something. That was, in fact, everything. Blackwell came on the 11th day. Not Calhoun, not hired men. Blackwell himself, which was exactly what Silas had predicted, and exactly what Ethan had been preparing for, because a man who has run out of tools eventually has to pick up the work himself. He rode up the mountain trail at mid-morning, with 2 men behind him, and no pretense of anything other than what it was, a powerful man coming to look at the thing that was threatening to undo him, needing to see it with his own eyes before he decided what to do about it. Ethan was in the yard when they arrived. He'd been there for an hour because he'd heard them on the trail before they cleared the tree line, and he'd had time to set down his tools and stand and wait, and he wanted Blackwell to see him standing and waiting. That mattered. The posture of a man who isn't surprised. Jonathan Blackwell was 60, or close to it, well dressed in the way of men who use clothing to remind other people of the distance between them. He had a broad face that had probably been handsome once, and had gone to something harder, and eyes that assessed everything they landed on for its potential utility. He looked at Ethan the way he probably looked at a piece of land he was considering purchasing, measuring, calculating, deciding on a price. "Mr. Walker," he said. "Mr. Blackwell," Ethan said. "I thought it was time we spoke directly." "I've been available for a conversation for 13 days, Ethan said. "You sent other people." Something moved in Blackwell's face at that, not quite embarrassment, but the recognition of a point. "May I get down?" "You can say what you came to say from up there," Ethan said. The 2 men behind Blackwell exchanged a look. Blackwell absorbed the discourtesy with the practiced ease of a man who had decided before he arrived that he was going to absorb whatever he needed to absorb. "I want to make you a better offer," Blackwell said. "The one my lawyer sent was inadequate, I understand that now. It wasn't inadequate, Ethan said. It was wrong. Name your number, Blackwell said, and his voice had the particular flat patience of a man who genuinely believed that everything had a number, that the only real question was where the decimal point landed. Whatever you think is fair. The families keep their land. The liens are cleared, and you and Miss Carter take whatever figure you name and go wherever you want to go. There's no reason this has to go to a federal court. There's one reason, Ethan said. Name it. Because you'll do it again. He said it simply, without heat. Not here, maybe. Not to these families, but somewhere else to other people, and there won't be any documents, and there won't be anyone to come fight back, and Jerome Calloway will have died on that road for nothing. He held Blackwell's gaze. I'm not taking your money. I'm not going anywhere. And in 2 days, Judge Whitmore is going to sit in Hadley Creek and hear everything. Blackwell looked at him for a long moment. You were a scout, he said. You understand strategy. You understand when a position is defensible and when it isn't. His voice had gone quieter, the salesman's register dropping away. You cannot win this, Walker. I have resources you had Harlan Good, Ethan said. And you had Roy Dugan. And you had Cole Calhoun. And you had a bank and a surveyor and a land company and 10 years of building something you thought was too big to touch. He took one step forward. Just one. And right now, there's a U.S. Marshal 2 days out from Denver, and a circuit court judge 2 days from Hadley Creek, and 6 families with sworn statements, and a dead man's affidavit, and a bank clerk named Edmund Marsh, who kept 3 documents that he should have destroyed, and a woman who walked 2 miles on a broken ankle to make sure none of it stayed buried. He stopped. Tell me again about defensible positions. Blackwell was very still on his horse. I didn't order Clearwater, he said. And the shift in his voice was something Ethan hadn't expected, not the voice of a man making an argument, but the voice of a man saying something he'd been not saying for a very long time. What happened there was, don't, Ethan said. Quiet. Absolute. Don't tell me what happened there. I was there. I know what happened. And I know what the letters in that envelope say about who ordered it, and who covered it up, and who decided that the most convenient solution was to put my name on it. He held the man's gaze and didn't move. You don't get to rewrite it to my face. The silence that followed was the kind that has the whole weight of a thing in it. Blackwell gathered himself. The calculating look came back, the lid closing over whatever had briefly surfaced. You'll regret this, he said. I've had regrets, Ethan said. I know what they feel like. This won't be one of them. Blackwell turned his horse. His 2 men turned with him. And Jonathan Blackwell rode back down the mountain trail the same way he'd come up, measured, controlled, showing nothing but. Ethan watched him go and saw what was underneath the control, the thing that Blackwell had been unable to hide in that one unguarded moment. He was afraid, not of losing money, not even of losing the land. He was afraid of what happened to a man when the story he'd told about himself for 30 years turned out to be something a judge could hold in his hand and read aloud in a courtroom. Ethan stood in the yard until the sound of the horses was gone. Then the cabin door opened behind him, and Abigail came out, and she'd heard all of it from inside. He knew she had, and she came to stand beside him, and they both looked down the trail at the space where Blackwell had been. He's going to run, she said. Maybe, Ethan said, but the marshal will be here before he can get far enough. You knew he'd come. I knew he'd have to see it for himself, Ethan said. Men like that, they need to look at the thing that's beating them. They can't accept it secondhand. She was quiet for a moment. He said you'd regret it. I heard. You didn't hesitate. No, he said. She looked at him with something that had been building in her face for the last 13 days, and that she hadn't quite let become fully visible until now. Ethan? Yeah. I think I'd like to see Colorado in the fall, she said. He turned to look at her. Everything he was feeling organized itself into something clear and certain, the way things became clear after a long time of being complicated. Good, he said. She smiled, not the controlled, almost smile she produced when she was being careful, but a real one, the kind that reached all the way, and it did something to the morning that made everything in it feel different. He touched the brim of his hat. Old habit. But she saw it, and the smile went a little wider. "Don't tip your hat at me," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and tipped it again deliberately, and she shook her head and went back inside, and he heard her laugh from inside the cabin. And he stood in the yard for another moment, just holding that sound in the summer air. 2 days later, Judge Clarence Whitmore arrived in Hadley Creek. He was a small, precise man of 65, with a reputation for impatience with delays and absolute patience for evidence, which was exactly the combination the situation required. He set up in the town meeting hall because the matter had grown beyond what any existing courtroom in the county could contain. And by the time the hearing was called to order, every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls and out through the door. Ethan sat at the petitioner's table with Arthur Hale on his left and Abigail on his right, and across the room, Jonathan Blackwell sat with 2 Denver lawyers who had arrived the previous evening, and who looked at the assembled Valley residents with the particular expression of men who had expected a smaller problem. U.S. Marshal Daniel Cord sat in the back row. He'd arrived the previous afternoon, read everything Hale had prepared, and said very little, which Ethan had found appropriately reassuring. A marshal who talked a lot before a hearing was a marshal compensating for something. Cord didn't seem to need to compensate. Blackwell's lawyers moved to dismiss before Hale had finished his opening. Whitmore denied the motion in approximately 15 seconds and told them to sit down in the tone of a man who had seen that move before and found it tedious. Then Hale started presenting. He was methodical, and he was thorough, and he was, Ethan realized with quiet relief, very good at what he did. He walked Whitmore through the documents in chronological order. The original land filings, the bank acquisition, the fraudulent loan records, Edmund Marsh's affidavit, identifying the fabricated signatures, Silas Drummond's mining claim dispute records, Robert Carter's corrected testimony about Clearwater. When Carter's affidavit was entered into the record, Blackwell's lead lawyer stood to object. Whitmore looked at him. "On what grounds?" "The affiant is deceased," the lawyer said. "The document cannot be cross-examined. The document is a sworn affidavit witnessed by a notary and 2 independent parties correcting testimony given in a prior proceeding," Hale said. "It is admissible as a sworn statement against interest. The affiant had every reason not to provide it and provided it anyway. That speaks to its credibility." Whitmore looked at the affidavit. He looked at Blackwell's lawyer. "Overruled," he said. "Continue, Mr. Hale." Blackwell sat very still through all of it. Ethan watched him from the corner of his eye, not with the hunger of a man waiting for revenge, but with the attention of a man who needed to understand what he was seeing. Blackwell had the look of someone watching a structure he'd built over decades come apart piece by piece, and knowing there was nothing left to do but watch. The calculating intelligence was still there in his eyes, but it had nowhere to go. Margaret Henderson gave her statement. She was the 4th witness Hale called, and she walked to the front of that room with her white hair pinned back hard and her Sunday dress and the absolute composure of a woman who had been afraid in private for 3 weeks and had decided that this was not the place for it. She stated the facts of the fraudulent lien clearly and without embellishment, and when Blackwell's lawyer cross-examined her and suggested that her husband might have taken out the loan without her knowledge, she looked at him with the patience of a woman who has outlasted men who underestimated her before. "My husband and I ran that ranch together for 31 years, she said. "We made every financial decision together. There was no loan. There was no debt. There was a piece of paper with my dead husband's name on it that your client fabricated, and I would like the court to note that I am calling it what it is." Whitmore made a sound that was not quite a smile, but was pointed in that direction. Thomas Henderson, sitting 3 rows behind Ethan, let out a breath so long it might have been 3 weeks of held air. Silas gave his statement. Edmund Marsh, who had come down from Denver with the marshal at Hale's request, gave his. The 3 fabricated loan documents were entered into evidence. The correspondence between Blackwell and Harlan Good was read aloud, and when the specific passages about Clearwater were read, the ones that described exactly how to use Ethan Walker as the explanation for what had happened. The room went so quiet that the sound of the hall's old walls settling was audible. Then Hale said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Ethan Walker." Ethan walked to the front of the room. He was aware of the faces watching him, the families, the townspeople who had come out of curiosity or obligation, or both the people who had heard his name attached to Clearwater for 7 years and were now hearing something different. He didn't look at any of them in particular. He looked at Judge Whitmore, who looked back at him with the focused attention of a man who was paid to determine the truth of things. He answered Hale's questions straight. He described what had happened the night of Clearwater in detail. He hadn't spoken aloud since the inquiry, the order he'd questioned the column's position, the 2 men who had physically prevented him from riding ahead to warn the encampment, the sound that came afterward. He said it all without embellishment and without evasion and without looking away from Whitmore. When Hale finished, Blackwell's lead lawyer stood. He asked 3 questions each designed to suggest that Ethan's account couldn't be verified, that memory was imperfect, that 7 years was a long time. Ethan answered each one the same way he'd answered everything else, straight factual without heat. Then the lawyer said, "Mr. Walker, isn't it true that you fled Colorado territory rather than defend yourself at the original inquiry?" The room shifted. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I didn't flee," he said. "I was told by the military court that the inquiry had concluded and that my presence was no longer required. I was stripped of my commission and told to leave. I left." He held the lawyer's gaze. "I spent 7 years alone on a mountain because I had been made to believe that there was nothing left worth fighting for. I was wrong about that." He paused. "I'm here now." The lawyer sat down. Whitmore looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at Jonathan Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, "do you wish to make a statement?" Blackwell looked at his lawyers. Something passed between them. Then Blackwell stood. He was still composed. Ethan gave him that. He stood in that room with every piece of evidence against him entered into the federal record, and he stood straight and he spoke clearly. "Your Honor," he said, "I have built my business in this territory through legal means, and I believe the documents presented today have been—" "Mr. Blackwell," Whitmore said, "I have read the correspondence entered into evidence this morning, including the letters that bear your signature, and discuss in your own words the arrangement made with Harlan Good regarding the falsification of the Clearwater inquiry record." He looked at Blackwell over his reading glasses. "I am not interested in your characterization of the other documents. I am interested in those letters. Do you wish to speak to them?" Silence. Blackwell's lead lawyer put his hand on his client's arm. "No," Blackwell said quietly. "I do not." "Then I think we're done for today," Whitmore said. What happened in the following hour moved faster than anything that had happened in the preceding 13 days, which was the nature of things that had been building for a long time. When they came apart quickly. Marshal Cord moved from the back of the room to the front, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. Blackwell's lawyers were very busy talking to their client in low, urgent voices. The room around them was very loud with the particular noise of people who have watched something happen that they hadn't been certain would happen. Thomas Henderson grabbed Ethan's arm the moment he got back to the petitioner's table. He didn't say anything. He just grabbed his arm and held it for a moment, and Ethan put his hand over the young man's, and they stood like that briefly, and that was enough. Margaret Henderson worked her way through the crowd to Abigail, and took both her hands and said something that Ethan couldn't hear from where he was standing, but he saw Abigail's face when she heard it, the way it opened up, the way she let herself be held in it, rather than deflecting it. Roy Duggan was in the back of the room. He'd come. Ethan realized on his own, not as an official presence, not in any capacity that required him to be there, just a man who'd needed to see how it ended. He met Ethan's eyes across the crowd and held them for a moment, and then he nodded once, the single nod of a man making a private accounting with himself, and looked away. Ethan let him have it. Silas found him near the door hat in his hand, working it around with his fingers, the way he did when he had something to say that he hadn't decided how to say yet. "You know what I keep thinking about," Silas said. "What's that?" "That girl walked 2 miles on a bad ankle," Silas said. "In the summer heat, with those documents." He kept working the hat brim. "And you found her on the trail, and brought her up and fed her, and wrapped her ankle and let her stay." He glanced at Ethan sideways. "My wife, God rest her, used to say you could tell everything about a man from what he did when nobody was watching." "That's a wise thing to say," Ethan said. "She was a wise woman." Silas put his hat back on. "You're not a bad man, Walker. You never were. It just took this long for the rest of the world to catch up to what your horses already knew." Ethan watched the old man walk away through the crowd and felt something in his chest that he didn't try to name, because naming it would make it smaller than it was. Whitmore issued his findings the next morning. He declared all foreclosure proceedings in Summit County under review pending federal investigation. He ordered the fraudulent liens vacated. He referred the matter of the Clearwater inquiry record to the federal court in Denver for formal review and correction of the military record. And he issued an order for the detention of Jonathan Blackwell pending arraignment on federal fraud charges. He also, at the end of his written findings in a single paragraph that Hale read aloud to the assembled group in the meeting hall, formally noted that the evidence presented was sufficient to conclude that the original court-martial proceedings against one Ethan Walker had been conducted on the basis of falsified and coerced testimony, and recommended that the military record be corrected accordingly. The room was very quiet when Hale read that paragraph. Then Margaret Henderson started clapping. She started it, and it spread, and it was not the polite applause of people going through emotion, but the real kind. The kind that comes out of relief that has been compressed into something very dense and finally has somewhere to go. Thomas was on his feet. Ruth Brewer had her hand over her mouth. Even Silas in the back was doing something with his hands that approximated applause while maintaining plausible deniability. Ethan sat at the petitioner's table and looked at his hands. He didn't feel what he thought he would feel. He'd expected something dramatic, some great release, some breaking open the 7 years coming out of him in a rush. Instead, what he felt was quieter than that, and he realized more real. Something settling, something finally after a very long time in the right place. Abigail's hand found his under the table. She didn't look at him. She was looking straight ahead at the room still filling with sound, her face still composed in the way she kept it composed in public. But her hand was around his, and her thumb moved once across his knuckles, and that small certain gesture said more than anything else in that hall had said all morning. He turned his hand over and held hers. They rode back to the mountain that afternoon, the two of them, because there was nowhere else either of them needed to be. The valley spread out below as they climbed, and the summer had that particular quality of late afternoon. The heat easing slightly, the light going golden, the mountains looking like something from a painting, even though Ethan had never been a man who thought in those terms, and wasn't going to start now. "Arthur Hale sent a bill," Abigail said after a while. "I'll pay it," he said. "The families want to contribute." "Then they can contribute," he said, "and Hale gets what's left." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did Silas say to you before we left?" "He said my horses always knew I was a decent man." She considered this. "He's not wrong." High praise from Silas. "The highest." She agreed. They rode a bit further. "My uncle's house in Laramie," she said. "I need to go back. Handle the estate. There are things that need to be sorted." His grip on the reins stayed easy, but something in him attended to the word "need" very carefully. "How long?" he said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. She paused. "And then I'd need somewhere to come back to." He looked over at her. She was looking straight ahead at the trail with the particular expression she used when she'd said something that mattered and was giving him space to respond to it without making it harder for him than it needed to be. "This mountain's not going anywhere," he said. "Neither am I," she said. Quiet. Certain. "If that's all right, Abigail." He said her name the way he'd been saying it in his head for 2 weeks fully without the careful distance he'd been maintaining around it. "There is nothing in my life right now that is more all right than that." She looked at him then, and the careful composure was entirely gone for a moment, just her face open, as uncalculated as he'd ever seen it. Something in her eyes that was new and very old at the same time. "Okay," she said, very softly. "Okay," he said. They came up the last rise to the cabin as the evening was coming in, and he took care of the horses while she went inside. And when he came through the door, she'd lit the lantern and started a fire. And there was coffee on. And the cabin that had been his entirely solitary life for 7 years felt in a way he hadn't known it was possible for it to feel like somewhere two people lived. He sat at the table. She set a cup in front of him without being asked. He caught her hand when she set it down, just for a moment, just long enough for her to understand he meant to, and she looked at their hands, and then at him, and the edge of her mouth came up. "Don't tip your hat," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. "You were thinking about it." He let go of her hand and picked up his coffee. "You can't prove that," he said. She sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at him over the rim. And outside, the summer evening was doing what summer evenings did in these mountains, settling into something beautiful that nobody needed to name for it to be real. "Tell me something," she said. "Something ordinary." He thought for a moment. "I've been trying to fix the fence on the north side for 2 weeks, and I keep putting it off." "Because it's hard, or because you don't like it?" "Because there's been a great deal happening," he said. "There has," she agreed. "What else? I planted squash in the spring and forgot about it, and now it's taken over about a third of the vegetable patch." "Ethan, I was busy. You were building a federal case." "Still." She laughed, and it was the easy kind, the kind that came from somewhere real, and it filled the cabin up in a way that 7 years of silence had never filled it. "I'll help you with the fence," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She met his eyes. "I want to." A pause. "And I'll deal with the squash." "You can try," he said. "I'm warning you, it's significant." "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," she said. "I have handled significant squash." He looked at her. This woman who had appeared on his trail broken and afraid, and had not in all the time since been anything less than exactly what the moment required. This woman who had walked 2 miles and ridden 4 days, and talked a frightened bank clerk into signing his name, and stood in Blackwell's path and held his hand under a table in a crowded room, and was now telling him with complete seriousness that she had experience with aggressive squash. "What?" she said, reading his face. "Nothing," he said. "You're smiling." "I'm not." "Ethan Walker, you are absolutely smiling." "I reckon," he said. "That's my business." She shook her head and looked down at her coffee, but he saw it the smile she was trying to keep to herself, the one that was brighter than the lantern, the one that was going to be harder to live without every time he saw it. Weeks passed. She went to Laramie. She was gone 26 days, which was 3 days longer than she'd said, and each of the extra 3 days had a specific quality of length that Ethan noticed and did not mention when she came back. The morning she returned, he was on the porch when he heard the horse on the trail, and he stood up without thinking about standing up, and when she came into the yard and saw him standing there, she swung down from the saddle and walked across the yard and stopped in front of him and just looked at him for a moment. 26 days, he said. "I know," she said. "The estate was complicated." "I figured." "Did you fix the fence?" "I did." "The squash." "You were right," he said. "It was significant." She looked up at him this close, and everything that had been building since the beginning of it, since a burning trail and a leather envelope, and a woman who knew his name, was in the space between them, quiet and enormous, and absolutely certain. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I think I'm home," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had given him back his name and his purpose, and the right to stop punishing himself for things that were never his fault, who had walked through fire, literal and otherwise, to put something true in the world, who had sat at his table and laughed at his bread, and held his hand when it mattered, and asked him what happened after, in a voice that already knew what she hoped the answer was. He reached up and touched her face just briefly, the back of his fingers against her cheek, and she leaned into it slightly, the smallest motion enough. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You are." She stepped into him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the summer morning on the mountain. And it was simple, and it was not simple at all, and it was the most natural thing that had ever happened in a life that had taken a very long road to get there. Later weeks after that, with the aspens beginning to turn gold, the way he'd told her they would, the way the whole mountain seemed to go on fire. In the best possible sense, every September, Margaret Henderson brought her sons and the Brewers and Silas and half the valley up to the mountain for what Margaret called a supper, and what turned out to be a great deal more than supper. Ruth Brewer brought a pie. Thomas Henderson, who had quietly taught himself to play fiddle during the long, anxious weeks of the federal proceedings, played it and played it badly, and everyone pretended otherwise. Abigail sat beside Ethan at the long table they'd moved outside, and her shoulder was against his, and above them the aspens were doing exactly what he'd said they would, and the mountain was entirely itself enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And the people around that table were laughing at something Thomas had said about the fiddle. Margaret Henderson caught Ethan's eye across the table and held it for a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just nodded once, the same slow nod she'd used when she'd listened to him in her kitchen those weeks ago. The one that said she understood exactly what was being said and had filed it away and trusted it. He nodded back. Abigail's hand found his under the table again, same as it had in the courtroom, same as it had become the language they used when words were either too much or not enough. He held it, and Ethan Walker, who had come to this mountain to disappear, who had built his silence one careful year at a time, who had spent 7 years believing that the best thing he could do for the world was to stay out of it, sat in the middle of his own life, surrounded by people who had fought beside him and been fought for, with the woman who had walked broken and determined onto his land, and handed him back everything he'd given up on, and understood fully, and without the need to examine it further, that this was what it felt like when a man stopped running from himself. Not a grand moment, not a dramatic revelation. Just this. Just the mountain, and the aspens, and the people, and her hand in his, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Thomas's fiddle hit a particularly wrong note, and everyone at the table winced and then laughed, and Abigail's shoulder shook against his, and Ethan looked up at the gold aspens burning against the blue Colorado sky, and let himself finally and completely and without reservation be glad. A person can lose their name. They can lose their years. They can lose their belief in their own worth. But as long as they have the courage to let someone find them, truly, find them the real and complicated thing underneath the silence, they are never, not for one moment, past saving. And a man who has finally forgiven himself is not a man who has forgotten what he carried. He is a man who has decided that what he builds next matters more than what was taken from him. That is not an ending. That is exactly where everything real begins.